All right, me. It is the very last day of July, and this morning I finished reading Murder Most Puzzling by Joel and John Jessup. This is not one continuous piece. It is a series of 54 vignettes that are all very, very short murder mysteries. Think very Encyclopedia Brown of it all. And in that sense, right, it's a fine enough piece. It is just this kind of collection of pretty simple, designed to make you feel clever, because the answer is right there, but the quote unquote detectives couldn't figure it out kind of deal, especially because part of the way that this is written is that, like, basically each mystery is like 3 pages, right? And the first page is pretty much just background to set you into the story, and then like the second page, the second and like the first half of the third page is all the here's what the detectives found, here's the information, and then like the last paragraph tells you just like the most important information and then it's like, oh, this is exactly how this goes, right? And so like they're designed to make you feel clever and feel smart, when in reality it's like it's saying here's the answer, what's the answer kind of deal. So that's all that, right? In terms of like, what's the good of reading something like this, right? Even though it's not necessarily the most, it is definitely pulp fiction in a lot of ways, and yada yada yada. To me, what would be interesting to pull from this would be to use this in a creative writing situation, or I really just kind of a creative writing situation of like, here is the foundational essence of how do you create kind of these mystery detective stories, right, in a very, very simplified fashion, right? And what we do with more traditional pieces is we take these very, very basic elements and that we just expand and expand and expand upon them, and we separate this information out and we parse this information out in a greater deal, and we're basically constantly doing this in layers and layers and layers and layers, versus this, where this is the basics, this is the essence of, here's 3 things, here's some basic information, here's a basic solution, right? So in terms of that, right, it's interesting, right? And certainly it occupied some time of my life, which in of itself is a good thing, right? The thing I was probably most annoyed at with this book is that like it has very much what I generally just refer to as the Marvelification of things, right? And it's not really Marvel's fault and the MCU's fault and whatnot, right? it is really this kind of evolution of entertainment and things, and how we interact with characters and things. But it is this progression of, you know, there's 5 external characters within this that are like doing the solving of things, right? And there's no reason for that. Right, the whole setup of the book is that there is this one woman, Amethyst, I believe it is, who is like a long-term crime writer and true crime writer and podcast writer and things. And she basically just gets burnt out. And then she ends up inviting 4 people that all have different backgrounds to come and help her and like just work through these cases, right? That's like the background of this, of what's happening here. And then all of these, the 54 cases are all, you know, short cases that have yet to be solved, kind of deal. But then like each little vignette has to start with the CSI Miami of it all, of the here's a segue and a non sequitur, and then here's a pun, and it's like, why are we doing this, right? We don't need all of these characters for this to work, right? We don't need the Marvelification of like, oh, this is an expansive universe of the world, and like all of these characters need to be witty and funny and unique and charming in their own way. Like we don't need that for this, right? We are adding chefs to a kitchen that doesn't need to have chefs, right? You know, it's a strange setup in that sense, right? And I don't understand why it occurred, but it did, right? And that's probably, you know, that's the most irritating thing, is that, you know, there's this half page at the beginning of each one of these that I'm annoyed at, that I can skip over. Then it is what it is, because it doesn't affect anything, right? Yeah, that's that. I think what's to lead into an actually more important discussion of things, right? What I do find very interesting, and I feel like I've talked about this at certain points, but I feel like this is a thing that I should harp on more, is that really a lot of these crime pieces that are about private detectives or you know, secondary detectives in true crime, right? What they are inherently is that they are very inherently, by definition, they have to be anti-cop and anti-police, which is an interesting thing to me, right? Because inherently what has to happen is that for these things to be unsolved, right, is that you have to have the police in the story not solve it, but then you have to write something which is then easy for the reader to understand and for the reader to solve, right? And so you end up with this stuff of like, and like, it's clear that there's an issue here that's happening within the way the book is written and the stories are written, of where like you have to have the police be idiots about things, but then you also have to have these things easy enough to completely understand and come to conclusions within 2.5 pages, right? And it's this, and it's not like 2 actual pages, right? It's really like a page and a half, you know, maybe a double-sided page. And so, you know, in terms of that, that's a fascinating thing to me, of like, they have to be anti-cop by definition. And you can see the struggle with it, though, because these are all supposed to be some sort of unsolved case, or interesting stories that are sitting in an Amethyst's, you know, backlog of stuff. And yet, so many of them end with the proposition of, well, the DI, the detective inspector, you know, whoever it is, knew who they needed to arrest. And then it is up to the reader to then say who they arrested, right? And so, like, you can tell that there's a struggle there, of where there's a sort of realization that, like, if we write this the way that we want to write this, of where these are solvable puzzles, then we have to make our system look like idiots. We have to, right? Which is inherently one of the things about true crime and about murder mysteries that is always really fascinated me, right? It's you know, it's this thing of, you have to, specifically true crime in a way, but like you inherently have to believe that the system is not working for true crime to really work in a lot of ways. And you know, for some people that's really off-putting, or it's just a thing that they don't think about. So yeah. So that's all that. I picked up this book as part of the Iowa Indie Bookshop Tour, which is just a whole bunch of independent bookshops throughout Iowa kind of got together and made kind of a tour type deal, which has been great. It's been fun. It's been a great way to see a whole bunch of Iowa that I wouldn't have really had a need to go to. So that's been fun. This book specifically I picked up because this interest that I have within interactive fiction, right? And I generally classify most kind of murder mysteries as interactive fiction, right? Part of the point of the book is that the reader interacts with it, right? And attempts to solve it, and attempts to outsmart or outwit or follow along the path of the writer, right? Where this is a much more focused version of that, of where the point of the book is that you solve it, right? Versus, you know, traditional crime novels and novellas that are like, you can enjoy them without feeling the need to solve them, whereas the point of this is to be interactive and is to challenge the reader to solve it. And in that case, that is very interesting to me, right? Because you know, it is the gamification of things, right? It is part of my own personal push to really involve and to view games as forms of literature, and that, you know, there are a great deal of books and thoughts and pieces and even poems that, instead of being transformed into traditional paper pieces, instead of being transformed, and the stories are being transformed into games because of this interactivity of things and this access that we now have to create those things at a much higher level, and a much easier level. So that's that. That's all I got about this book. It's not much about the book, it's about these other things, but that's Murder Most Puzzling.